This video will finish up the vocabulary terms for Chapter 7. We did the first 41 over the last two videos, and today we'll go through numbers 42 through the end. Let us start with William Howard Taft. He had been chosen, personally had chosen by Teddy Roosevelt to succeed him as president. And of course, this was long before the days of the direct primary system. And so a few powerful people in back rooms, maybe smoking cigars, drinking cognac, whatever, got together and decided who was going to run. Teddy Roosevelt was the most popular political figure in the time. And so he said, hey, I want Taft to succeed me. And Taft got the nomination, and he won the election rather easily. Republican politics, Republican policies were extremely popular at this time. And so he really won with very little opposition. Though he was quite similar to Teddy Roosevelt in a number of issues, again, a number of issues such as trust busting, he did differ in a few. And it was those differences which eventually led him to come cross with Teddy Roosevelt. And not only that, he was not a very skilled politician. Now again, that's probably a compliment based on today's politics, but he really wasn't a politician. And some of the things that he did, some of the things that he said, alienated many within the party and therefore caused all kinds of problems. Now, he did attempt to reverse a few of TR's policies, and this is where he got into trouble with Teddy Roosevelt. The biggest one was when he, Taft, attempted to sell some of the government land that had been set aside by Roosevelt years before, to sell land set aside for national parks and national monuments. This angered the conservationist Roosevelt, and he sought to regain the presidency, which leads us to number 43, the Bull Moose Party. TR sought the Republican Party nomination in 1912 because, again, he felt that Taft had been mishandling the nation. Taft had not continued to follow the policies that Roosevelt had set, and therefore Roosevelt, would have to step in to save the nation, to restore what he felt the nation needed to do, with the direction the nation needed to go, that had been taken off course by Taft. Unfortunately for Teddy, he lost the nomination to Taft, but then he created the third party, which he refers to, or is generally referred to in history as the Bull Moose Party. The official name was the Progressive Party. But one day, Roosevelt was being interviewed by a reporter, and the reporter asked him about his health. I mean, Teddy was getting up there in age. And Teddy said, well, I feel as strong as a bull moose. Well, as you can well imagine, the political cartoonists of the day went wild with that. They had all kinds of political cartoons of Teddy Roosevelt's face on a moose, Teddy Roosevelt's face with moose horns. I mean, it was actually kind of funny. But the third party, the Bull Moose Party, challenged the two conventional parties, the Republicans, whose nominee was William Howard Taft, the incumbent president, and the third party in the race, of course, was the Democrat Party, and its nominee was Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson is a former governor of New Jersey, and because of the split in the Republican voters, again, keep in mind, both Taft and Roosevelt are Republicans. Taft is the incumbent president. Roosevelt is the former president. Because of the split of the votes between those two Republicans, I mean, regardless what party Roosevelt claimed to be a member of, what party was next to his name on the ballot, people still saw him as a Republican. Because of that split in votes, then Wilson was able to win the 1912 election, though if you add up the popular votes that Wilson got, compare them to the popular votes that Taft and Roosevelt received, the Republican candidates, Taft and Roosevelt, easily gained more popular votes. And more than likely, if there had only been one Republican running, either Roosevelt or Taft, more than likely they would have probably defeated Wilson. But again, whenever a third party splits the votes within a single party, again, in this case the Bull Moose Party splitting the votes of the Republicans, the other party, in this case the Democrats, tend to win. Now, the New Freedom was a nickname given to Wilson's domestic policies, and we're going to look at those in some depth on the next slide. He sought to tame big business encourage greater competition, and eliminate special privileges. Now, again, keep in mind, the Republicans were the party of laissez-faire, hands-off economic policies. The Democrats were a little bit different. They looked at things a little bit differently than the Republicans did. And Wilson's policies, the New Freedom, attempted to change some of the Republican party policies that have been in place for some time. Let's move on to the next slide. As we wait for it, we're going to look at some of the legislative reforms brought to office by President Woodrow Wilson. We have a number there. You can see them. And let's start with letter A, the Underwood Tariff. Now, keep in mind, tariffs are taxes on imported and exported goods. Wilson believed that high tariffs benefited rich monopolists but hurt the average Americans. Again, keep in mind, high tariffs favor the industrial area of a country. In this case, in America, the New England, the Great Lakes area was heavily industrialized and, of course, heavily Republican. It was the South and the Midwestern states, to the west of the Mississippi to the Rockies, that were heavily Democrat because they were primarily agricultural. So high tariffs help industrial areas, hurt agricultural areas. So as a Democrat, Wilson wanted to cut tariffs, which he felt then would make it better or make it easier for the average American to buy goods. Now, of course, this is the exact opposite of what Republicans have been doing for years. He got the Underwood Tariff Bill passed and signed into law, and this lowered tariffs by 25%. Now, again, tariffs are taxes. So if you cut this tax, the conventional thinking is, well, you got to make up for that lost revenue, so you have to bring money in some other way. So to do that, he introduced the nation's first income tax. Which takes us to letter B, the graduated income tax, also known as the, I'm sorry, let me make that a little bit neater. That may not be neater, but the 16th Amendment. So the 16th Amendment is an income tax. It's a graduated tax system. What that means is the higher a percentage you earn, the higher a percentage you pay. Now, keep in mind, this has been the law of the land since the early 19 teens. And it's something we accept as normal. But never before in our nation's history had we ever taxed income. And to this day, there's still a great deal of controversy about it. And the Congress, split between Republicans and Democrats, argue back and forth what is best. Should the rich, again, rich changes depending upon your definition, but should the rich pay more? The Democrats argue the rich don't pay their fair share, so they should pay a higher percentage income tax. Republicans argue that the rich do pay a huge chunk of the income tax that's paid in this country, so they should pay a lower rate. And we'll get to that a little bit later on as we progress throughout the rest of the year. But the 16th Amendment, it gave the federal government the power, and let me fix that right there a little bit. It gave the power of the federal government to tax income. Now, as you can well imagine, this has all kinds of problems just set up waiting to happen, and we'll discuss some of those as we go. Now, somewhat ironically, it is kind of fun when you think about it for a moment that the original attempt at taxing income, which was a law passed by Congress, was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that an income tax was unconstitutional, and of course, whenever that happens, the only thing that you can do then is then pass an amendment. So the 16th Amendment is passed. Letter C, the Federal Reserve Act, 1913. Again, keep in mind, Wilson is elected in 1912. He takes office early in 13, and so we are seeing a number of things, important things happening in the very first year of his administration. We have the Underwood Tariff, 1913. We have the income tax, 1913. We have the Federal Reserve System, 1913. And, oh yes, down here, we have the creation of the Department of Labor, 1913. So his first year in office was filled with a lot of big events, a lot of big legislation that we still are affected by to this day. Okay, let's get back to the Federal Reserve Act. The act reformed the banking industry by establishing 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. You could call these a banker's bank. When you take money to the bank and you put it in the bank in a savings account, they don't put it in a jar with your name on it on a shelf. They keep part of the money so they can have a daily amount, and that's based on a complicated process we're not going to worry about. They keep a certain amount of money for their day-to-day business. The rest of it they send to the Federal Reserve Bank. In the case of us here in Texas, it's in Dallas. So that Federal Reserve Bank is the banker's bank. Let's say you go to a bank, doesn't really matter which one, Bank of America, okay? And it has, the bank you deal with has deposits of $100 million. Well, they're not going to keep all $100 million in their bank. That's too much of a temptation for someone trying to steal. So they keep a certain amount per day, per week, per month. The rest goes to Dallas and the Federal Reserve Bank there. And if they need money, they call them and they ship the money down to them. Now, this act also allowed the Federal Reserve System to regulate money in circulation by controlling the amount of money that banks could lend. Okay? This is extremely important. We are now looking at the federal government becoming more and more involved in the banking business, dictating policy. How much money can a bank keep? How much money can a bank loan? What kind of interest rates can banks force upon, or the government force upon the banks? Letter D, the Clayton Antitrust Act. And again, we've talked about antitrust previously. This increased the federal government's power. It increased the power of the federal government to prevent unfair business practices. And again, antitrust legislation is designed to break up trust, to break up monopolies, to bring about fairer competition. And this one in particular, the Clayton Antitrust Act, gave the federal government more power. Federal Trade Commission, created to further protect consumers. And again, what we're looking at is protecting consumers from unfair business practices by corporations. The federal government wants to assure the public that the federal government, are doing everything they can to protect us from whichever company. Choose one. Carnegie Steel, Vanderbilt Standard Oil, the meatpacking industry. We're only a few years removed from the jungle and the horrors that were mentioned in the book that led to all kinds of legislation being passed to ensure that the food we consume, the medicines we buy and take, are safe. And so this is just another step toward that. Letter F, Department of Labor. Congress created a separate cabinet. Now, this is a cabinet-level position. What that means is the president has a group of advisors referred to as the cabinet. Each one is supposed to be an expert in their field. So the Department of Labor was created in 1913. Again, there's that date, 1913, in which, as we talked a bit earlier, Wilson was extremely busy dealing with the creation of new legislation, new laws going into effect. Again, a very busy first year. Anyway, getting back to this, the Congress created a separate cabinet to study the problems of labor, okay, problems of labor, collect statistics, and enforce federal labor laws. Now, of course, over the decades, the Department of Labor has grown tremendously. But that was its original intent, to provide information to the president and to Congress, first the president, which he would then share with Congress probably, to help create a better system to protect consumers and provide fairer competition. Finally, the Child Labor Act of 1916 prohibited sales of goods, prohibited the sale of goods created by child labor. Now, eventually it was overturned by the Supreme Court a couple years later, and I realize you can't see it because of Doceri desktop trial right there, but it created a starting point where we would then move toward removing children, again we're talking children under the age of 16, remove them from the workforce and allowing them to be kids. And it's also about the time we're starting to look at the state level and eventually at the national level the requirement of children that age to be in school. All right, let us move on to the next slide. And as we are waiting for it, there we go. I think I need to go back one. Yeah, yes, I do. Sorry about that. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. This has been mentioned before by me. It was in a video that we saw earlier in the week. Essentially what happened in 1911, the year 1911, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened there. Let's go back. There we are. No, we're not. One of these days we'll get to there we are. It's a miracle. Of course, the miracle didn't last very long, did it? I should probably stop pushing buttons. I think, okay, we're ready. We're ready. Yes, we are. 1911. There we go. We had 146 garment workers that were killed in a fire. The bulk of them, women. They died in the fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which is in a high floor of a skyscraper. After the fire was over, the investigation proved that the ownership had done several things that led to the death of this huge number of people. Number one, the factory doors had been bolted shut from the outside of the building, therefore cutting off escape from the fire. The building also lacked a sprinkler system and only had one fire escape because of these items, these things. The reckless way in which the owners put the lives of their workers in danger. The public sentiment for labor grew. The public sentiment for labor grew when it learned that all these things had occurred. So we're looking at, in 1911, we're still looking at a divide between labor, owner and employee, labor and big business. The government was and had been for a number of years on the side of big business. Labor was trying to catch up. We're still a few years away from the beginning of widespread unionization, the improvement in labor conditions, better pay, so forth and so on. And so because of this tragedy, and there's no other way to explain what happened than to call it a tragedy, 146 people dying, really that could have been prevented, is a tragedy. So because of this, we see more and more desire by the public for the government to step in, to intervene, and ensure that the workplace is a safe place. Okay, the next three, 48, 49, and 50. You know what? I think I'm going to leave the red color for a while. These are three items that go toward or go under the heading of women's rights, women's suffrage. Susan B. Anthony, a prominent reformer, attempted to vote. By the way, she attempted to vote several times, but attempted to vote in Rochester, New York. She was denied due to her gender, because she was a woman. Women were not yet granted universal suffrage. Now, as we've discussed previously, there were a number of states out west where women could vote in some elections. And there were some places back east where women could vote in some elections, but not universally. They couldn't vote in every election. They could only vote in certain elections, and again, only certain women. She became the leader of the women's suffrage movement. Add to that Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Those two women, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, formed the National Association. The National Association. Try it again. Sorry about that. The National American Women. I butchered that terribly. I'm sorry. National American Woman Suffrage Association. Yay, I got it. Okay. These two women, two pioneers in women's suffrage, formed the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Now, what this did was fight for women's suffrage. Because of their efforts and World War I, which we'll get to why and how that occurs in a couple of chapters, War I, women were eventually given universal suffrage in 1920 thanks to the 19th Amendment. And from that moment forward, women have been able to vote universally in all elections in every state. I'm going to stop it at this point, and then we'll have another short video that will go into some of the art and literature that you find in the back of the chapter. So we're going to end the third video over the vocabulary term at this point, and we'll take up the rest, numbers 51 through 60, in another video. Thank you very much. Bye.